Hey guys, welcome to another Touch Loops video. So today we're going to look at how we can beef up drum loops. More specifically, we're going to make this sample based, so we want to show you how if you bought a loop that you really like but it's not quite got the characteristics you want, we're thinking more bottom end, a bit fatter, maybe more distortion, what you can do to remedy that and also mean you can carry on using the loop and it also fit into your track with way more attitude and vibe. So let's have a little listen to our loop. There's nothing on it, everything's turned off. Really cool, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with compression, and this can be a little bit confusing for people, so I'm going to talk you through my settings. What I've got is I've got a ratio of 3:1, which isn't anything too high. The attack time is kind of where the most important thing is happening on this for me. The attack is the speed at which the compressor starts to work, so how long does it take for the compressor to start grabbing and showing gain reduction? If we've got a drum loop where we've got the compression time, the attack time, really fast, taking into account that 44 milliseconds is still pretty damn quick, we're going to start seeing reduction that's taking the transients away from our drums, and instead of making them sound fatter and beefing them up, they're actually going to start sounding worse and they're going to sound flat. So what we can do is we can do a little example where we play it and we change the attack time in real time so you can hear the effects of this. So let's go to 0.1 milliseconds, which is incredibly fast. Start to slow it down. As you can hear, probably around the 20 millisecond area, perhaps a little bit slower, things start to really change and we start to get that initial click back from the kick and the snares, which is exactly what we're looking for. We want this to sound like it's got more attitude and it's got a little bit more drive and way more weight to it. So let's have one more go at that and just really listen for around the 20 millisecond mark and just see if you can pick out what's changing. This area here. So it's all about trying to find the sweet spot. I'd say around this kind of area. I'm really getting the knock of the kick now, which I think sound great. The release time is how fast it takes the compressor to get back to its normal state. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to time the gain reduction, so by the time the next kick comes in, the compressor is showing no gain reduction and we're ready to go for the next one. By setting these times like this, it means we can get a really musical result, and it means that our release time's in time with the tempo of our session, basically. So everything's moving as one, it's really organic. So next I'm going to look at EQ. This is something else you should turn to next, if you ask me. There's a couple of things I'm going to do. First, I'm going to talk about this low-mid section, which is an area that comes up often, and people refer to it as being boxy, or being muddy, or being dirt, or being just the cloud, I suppose, in a really good mix. What's happening around here is we've got the top of the kick, bottom of the snare kind of area, sometimes low percussion. It can sound a little bit muddy and wompy. So what I've done is I've pulled some out. There's not that much to remove here, but it's quite a good example to show you what's in there, basically. So if we listen to it. So it's nothing too huge, but if I boost it, you'll really start to pick out what I'm talking about. Super resonant area. Now this isn't too bad, but quite often on all the kicks and bass instruments, you're going to get really kind of like strange sounds that just don't really sound that tight and don't sound that great. So what we can do is we can just pull them out like that. Probably a bit too much. Because we're going to do processing, there's a good chance I'm going to want to high pass this kick to make sure there's no sub frequencies going to my master. Now you'll realize if you look on the feedback here, we've got quite a lot of energy happening around this 20 hertz mark, and there's just not many systems that are playing back 20 hertz these days. And it's gonna become a mess, especially when you start getting towards your final mix. So what we can do is we can slowly high pass, but we don't want to go too far because we're going to lose the weight of the kick. So for me, around the 20 hertz mark, really focused, nice and tight, and we're starting to get a sound that we like. So if we want more bottom end in this kick, we could turn to the EQ again and start pushing the bottom end. Fundamental for this kick, at the look of it, it's around 60 Hertz, so we'll hit that. Narrow the Q a bit. Definitely helps, but what I'm going to do is instead I'm going to layer another kick drum sample over the top of it so we can really start getting some weight. So if we go into this second channel, this is the kick I've chosen because I think this has got a lot more body to it than the one we're using currently. Super fat, really, really fat. So what I can do is I can layer them up. Now, when layering samples, it's really worth thinking about phase. And the phase relationship between the two is going to be crucial in making sure we get a really good drum sound and a really good kick sound. It can be confusing for understanding what phase is, but I think this is probably going to clear things up for you. So what I've done is I've zoomed in really far into the waveform. You can see my original drum loop here, and the one in pink is my sample. What I'm looking for a mirror image between these waveforms. So as you can see, as this goes up, I'm hitting relatively the highest point, and same again. Because the kicks are slightly different frequencies, you can see it's going to change over time, and this is where it can get a little bit tricky. But then it kind of starts to follow itself again, and it's not too bad. Because the drum loop's been programmed in such a way where it's not bang on the grid, you see, like there's the grid line, but obviously we get this little bit of time. What I've had to do is I've had to go in and manually set these to places which I think are the best and try and do it by eye, basically. So you could argue this one could go back a touch to get that highest point, maybe. It could be kept. Things start to get a bit strange there, but it's not too bad, and it kind of follows. So it's worth doing that. Obviously, the loop kind of comes back round again on the next bar, so that's not too bad. But you could argue again, maybe this one should be a bit further back. We just need to get a balance between getting things perfectly in phase and stopping them from being flamming. Obviously, if we push things completely out of time, they're not going to be hitting at the same time, so you're going to be losing energy. It's going to sound weird. One thing we can do to check phase is something called a utility tool in Ableton, or in most DAWs they'll have an EQ. You're basically looking for something that has these little dials, which is a 0 with a cross through it. What this does is it flips the sound completely 180 on its head. So where that's going up, the sound would now be going down, and vice versa. We can test to see how well these two things are sounding together by using the phase tool. So let's listen to it without. And with. So we're losing all that bottom end we've been adding, and that's because the frequencies are clashing, they're cancelling each other out, and we're ending up with 0. Obviously, if something goes down by 100 and something goes up by 100, the middle ground is 0. So we lose the frequency, basically. So it's always worth testing. You do get a completely different sound. Next up, let's talk about parallel compression. So we've got our drums, we've got our effects on them, we've got an EQ, we've got a compressor, in phase kick. Here we go. Okay, so what we're going to do first is we're going to check parallel compression. Now, what parallel compression is, it's another form of compression, quite similar to what we just did, but instead of going for this kind of like natural sound that's really pushing the transients, we're trying to bring up the body of the sound, so later on in the hit, if you will. The release time, the decay, all those kind of areas in the sound. So what we've done is we've got a compressor which has a much quicker attack time and also a really quick release, because we want this to be hyper, we want it to be exaggerated. But by using this blend dial, which is how much of the dry signal, how much of the wet signal is coming through, we can actually get a really nice combination of the two. So if we listen to this with full wet, so obviously 100%, we can hear what it's doing. It's going to be wild. So sounds pretty mental, probably not going to be usable. I doubt it's really helped us from where we were. If anything, it's made it worse. But what's cool is we can use this wet dry dial, and start bringing back the original sound that we've created and get a really good combination of the two. The hyper real life of this compressor, which is all over the place, with the great transients that we had originally. So let's fade it back in. So So what it's done is it's really brought up the noise, it's really brought up the end of the sound, but it's also means, because we've got that dry signal in there, we're still getting that transient, which is sounding absolutely mega. Let's use the same concept, but try it with saturation. You've probably heard people talking about parallel saturation or parallel distortion. It's exactly the same concept. We're looking for a plugin that distorts things, but has a wet-dry dial. So Decapitator by Sam Toys is a really good example of that. If you haven't got Decapitator, bear with me. We're going to use Ableton plugins as well, so I can show you how it's possible, even if you don't own this. This is just a great example of analog style compression, I suppose you could call it. So let's listen to it with the drive pretty high, full wet. Completely bonkers, probably a little bit too much attitude going all over the place. But what's great is we can actually start fading back in the original loop in the same way we did with the parallel compression. And we can hear how we can get a blend between the two. So that's a really cool way of getting attitude into your loops, but without losing the original kind of vibe of the sample and without losing the transients, which we've worked quite hard to get at. It'd be a shame to squash those because saturation's rounding off waveforms basically. And it's also a form of compression. So we kind of need to be careful we don't lose what we've just gained. But this is really nice having this dial here and leaves us with something which is incredibly usable and a step up from where we were. Last but not least, I want to show you how we can use some Ableton plugins, but use them in a way they probably weren't designed for, but I think gets really cool characteristics. So same drum loop, same samples, all layered, all in phase, everything's looking great. Here's where we're at the minute. I'm firstly going to bring in Echo. Now this plugin's based on like an old Space Echo or an Echoplex or something on those lines back from the 70s. What's cool about those is they've got a really good preamp in them which can be abused and pushed to create things it's not really meant to. So what I've done is I've set my delay time to as fast as possible, 1 millisecond. We're going to push our drum out by 1 millisecond, but it's on the group, so our kick will still be in time, nothing's going to flam, it's all going to be great. I've made sure everything's turned off that I don't want, probably don't need these. Definitely don't need the filter section because that's going to change the sound. Modulation, not doing anything, it's cool. I'm going to start pushing the input and you'll see how we get this amazing distortion. On this one, we're going to need to keep it full wet because it's obviously changing the time relationship of the sample. If we started to fade this back in again, the wet signal would be a millisecond out, which potentially could start to phase. So let's listen to it. Really fat, sounding absolutely insane. I love it. So what I'm doing here is I'm balancing the input and the output. Obviously, as I put more in, I want to like keep the levels a little bit more under control. But what's cool is we've got a delay, so let's use it. You know, let's use the effects. We've got the reverb. Try that. All these things can be automated. Cool little idea for a build. Let's try the noise out. Why not? Really sick and really effective. Also, we've got an EQ built in this. Why not use that? Same again, could be cool for a build up, could be cool for an intro, could be cool for a drop, breakdown. The Echo plugin's done amazing things for us, but it's also created some artifacts which are a little bit unwanted. So what I've done is I've put an EQ next to it, and this can really showcase what we were talking about earlier about these low mid areas being a little bit wompy and a little bit too much. So let's listen to what I've taken out. So it's really exaggerated that kind of like resonant frequency of the kick, and it was just a little bit too much. So what I've done is I've pulled it out, which tightened things up. High passed a little bit, which is obviously controlling the subs. And then I've also had a tiny bit of brightness here. So without the EQ and with. Super into it. So the last thing we're going to show you is the auto filter. Now, one thing that goes nicely with this, I don't know if you've seen this, I found this a couple of years ago. Ableton has this cool little section here called the info view, and what that does is it shows exactly what you're clicking on and what your mouse is hovering over. So if I go on here, it's going to tell me down there what the envelope does. This section here, when you load the filter in, won't have anything available to us that's any more interesting than a normal filter. But as we change down here, we've got different modes. And if we hover over this, we can see it's 5 different circuit types that go from state variable circuits with clipping to different circuit types, basically, and a combination of them. So famous filters through the last 40, 50 years. What we can do is we can use this drive section here and actually turn this into a saturator. So let's listen and start adding some drive. Try the different settings, why not? And the last couple. And then because it's a filter, but you know, we can automate those things and use it as a filter in our sessions. It's all built into one, it's great. So there you have it. A few little tips which I think are quite interesting for beefing up your drum loops and getting them into a place where they weren't previously. As always, like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you want me to cover, or if there's anything I missed, anything that you found a little bit confusing, and things of the sort. So yeah, thanks guys.